Good afternoon. My name is Patricia Maria Weinman, and I'm Associate Coordinator of Radius at MIT. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today. For more information about Radius, please go to our website at radius.mit.edu. I would now like to introduce Robert Plotkin, who will act as moderator and in turn will introduce our special guest today, Dr. William Edelglass. Robert is a member of Radius's steering committee and has been an incredibly important part of our series called Hack Your Mind. It's a small committee comprised of Radius staff, Robert, a number of staff at MIT Medical and MIT faculty. And to any of those committee members watching, thank you for all your help with this series. Robert is an alum at MIT, and a patent attorney specializing in intellectual property. In addition, he's the founder of Technology for Mindfulness, and I encourage you to visit his website. It's a fantastic resource for those interested in incorporating mindfulness into their lives and to finding a balance between this incredibly difficult technological world and mindfulness. I'll post the URL in the chat. We will leave time at the end for questions, so please feel free to use the Q&A function at any time. And Robert, Professor Edelglass, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Trish, for the introduction. I'm really glad to be here today and to introduce William Edelglass. I'm not going to go through his extensive background in mindfulness, other than to say that I think he's the perfect person to be here today to talk about mindfulness and ethics. As mindfulness has become more of a mainstream topic of interest to more and more people, something that many people are dipping their toes in, so many people are wondering about what is the relationship between mindfulness and ethics? Is there a relationship between mindfulness and ethics? We've heard a lot of this in our committee. I've noticed a lot of it, and concerns about the way that mindfulness is being taught now in the mainstream. Does it have an ethical component to it? Is it something that helps people be more ethical, or maybe just helps people be more mindful at whatever they're doing, whether that is ethical or not? So again, I think Dr. Edelglass is the perfect person to be here addressing this topic for all of us. I'll tell you a little bit about him. He's the Director of Studies at the Barre Center for Buddhist Studies and Associate Professor of Philosophy and Environmental Studies at Emerson College. He's written very extensively about topics relating both to mindfulness and Buddhist ethics and Western philosophy and Western ethics. Some of his recent projects covered phenomenology and climate ethics, critical reflections on the science of meditation. He's on many esteemed committees and journals. And I think that today he'll be able to tell you about both the philosophy, theory of ethics, but also the practice of it within mindfulness. So I will turn it over to Dr. Edelglass. I know he'll be very open to questions. So if you have questions, post them in the Q&A and I'll field them. We've got an hour, so we want to make it interactive. And Dr. Edelglass, thanks so much for being here. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much, Robert. And thank you, Tricia. I'm honored to be here. And maybe before we start, just a reminder to those of you who are watching that, at least for me, it helps to think about maybe 3 questions, either critical or comments you might want to make. It helps me when I'm listening to a talk to attend in a more engaged way. So Robert had said that there's some folks at Radius working on mindfulness, and that there had been some concerns raised about ethics and mindfulness. And so this talk is somewhat oriented towards people who might be a little bit skeptical. From what I hear, there are some critically thinking folks at MIT, and I am glad to to address my talk to you. I'm going to share a PowerPoint and talk through my PowerPoint, and then I'll end my PowerPoint at the end of my talk, and we'll have time for questions. So the first point to make is that mindfulness, as Robert was saying, is everywhere, it seems, these days. A lot on mindful eating, being non-judgmental and savoring. There's mindful money, how to be mindful around money. There's mindfulness for warriors, the military meditation coach, a lot of mindfulness in the military. There's mindful athletics, people working to improve their performance using mindfulness. There's mindful parenting. As a parent of 6-year-olds, I have no idea who has time to read books about mindful parenting, but they're out there. And there's even mindful sports parenting for those people who want to mindfully parent and raise their kids to be athletes. There's a ton of work on mindfulness at work, how to have conditions such that employees are improving their performance and less stressed, doing what corporations expect them to do. There is a lot of work on mindful sex. And mindful sex can lead to mindful birthing. And that can lead to a mindful marriage. But if that doesn't work out, there's always mindful divorce. A lot of resources on how to divorce mindfully. Either way, there's mindful aging, and eventually there's mindful dying. And on the way, if you want, you can eat mindful mayo and mindful mince. I got these two examples from a wonderful book by Jeff Wilson called Mindful America, The Mutual Transformation of Buddhist Meditation in American Culture, which is a fabulous book on the way mindfulness has changed, all the places where you find mindfulness, and really great analysis of mindfulness in America. It's also the case, though, that there's a great deal of science that is now devoted to mindfulness. You can see there were a few early studies. Here's my cursor in the mid-80s. And sometime after the turn of the millennium, you get a few more. And then in the last 5 or 6 years, it really increases dramatically. And what these studies generally suggest is that there are a lot of effective mindfulness-based therapies. Mindfulness in the arts therapies. There's acceptance and commitment theory and mindfulness for psychosis. Mindfulness for insomnia. Cognitive behavior therapy. If you look at the slide up at the top, or the image up at the top, there are a whole variety of disorders or illnesses, stress, anxiety, eating disorders, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, bipolar disorder. And they are mindfulness-based therapies for all of these. And at least what the social psychologists and others tell us is that these are actually effective. So the original mindfulness-based therapy was mindfulness-based stress reduction. And if you look at the image on the top, the green box, you can see what supposedly social scientists have documented as the benefits of mindfulness-based stress reduction courses. So reductions in depression and anxiety, greater ability to cope with stress, pain, and illness, better sleep, increased attention and concentration, less emotional reactivity, better physical health, improved well-being overall, but also improved immune functioning, increased sense of connection, meaning, and purpose. It's pretty dramatic what one sees here as the benefits that have been documented for MBSR. And in general, there is a body of work now which suggests that mindfulness is correlated with happiness to some degree. So if you're in Cambridge at MIT, two folks down the street, the social psychologists Matt Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert, who are at Harvard, they did a fairly sizable study with thousands of participants. They gave each of them a handheld device and contacted them at random times during waking hours. And basically asked three questions. What are you doing? What are you thinking about? And how happy are you? And there was a strong correlation between being happy and thinking about what people were actually doing. So, what is it that we're talking about that has this profound impact on people's lives? Or that people say has this profound impact? One of your own at MIT, Jon Kabat-Zinn, who did his PhD at MIT, has perhaps the most famous definition of mindfulness. And that is the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. This is a definition that is widely used, but there are a number of others that get at something similar. Jon Kabat-Zinn is rooted in Buddhist traditions and has said at various times that MBSR really is a modern embodiment of the Buddha Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, that was trying to bring Buddhism into the contemporary world. And it's very hard to understand mindfulness today, both culturally but also conceptually, without grounding it in some ways in Buddhist traditions. And there is a word in two classical Indian Buddhist languages, one being Pali, the other Sanskrit, sati or smriti, which mindfulness is a translation of. And if you look at the various meanings of this word, recollection, attention, attentiveness, calling to mind, fixing the mind on something, you get a sense there's a kind of family of meanings that has to do with attending to an object and maintaining that attention. And I would offer a definition that's slightly different than Jon Kabat-Zinn's, that would be more rooted in Buddhist traditions. That is essentially fixing attention on an object and maintaining this attention with vigilance. That's basically what being mindful is. What sorts of objects might one fix one's attention on? In the earliest, most significant text on mindfulness, the Discourse on the Foundations of Mindfulness, the Satipatthana Sutta, there are four primary objects that one would fix one's attention on. The body, so the popular practice of attending to our breath would be part of the body, but doing a body scan, which is also part of MBSR, our feelings, what's going on in our mind, and mental phenomena here really are ideas. So the impermanence of our body, for example, the way in which everything is impermanent. So mindfulness can be thought of as a cognitive state or a mental event. So right now, if you're paying attention to what I'm saying, perhaps looking at these slides, you are being mindful. You're being mindful in this moment. Another way of thinking about mindfulness, which is slightly different, is as a character trait, part of who you are that subsists even when you're not being mindful in any particular moment. We might think of you as a mindful person overall. So, one might ask the question then, what does all of this have to do with ethics? Clearly, there seem to be benefits to our mental and physical health, and benefits in a whole variety of areas of our lives when we practice mindfulness. At least, certainly that is what the social psychologists tend to tell us. And personally, as somebody who does do mindfulness practice, or kind of a Buddhist rooted mindfulness practice. I do feel better when I am practicing if I have half an hour a day to sit mindfully on a cushion. But what does that have to do with ethics? And people have raised the question of, what about the mindful sniper? Or you can think of the mindful assassin, or you can think of the mindful thief. That is it the case that mindfulness is just a tool that we can use, and that it can be employed in a way that simply gets me what I want without really impacting the values of what I want at all? So the thief who comes in the night, or the assassin, needs to be mindful to obscure their tracks. So mindfulness is really important, and is all this learning about mindfulness. How do we think about that in relationship to ethics? And in that, raising that question, one of the things that it does is that it shows some of the differences between contemporary ethics, or contemporary mindfulness, and the mindfulness is practiced in classical Buddhist traditions. So in the Satipatthana Sutta, for example, and in most, but not all, Buddhist practices of mindfulness, there are some exceptions to this, but in many Buddhist practices of mindfulness, one of the things that one does is be mindful of the wholesomeness or unwholesomeness of our mental states. And we evaluate our mental states. Is this particular mental state one which is aversive? Is it problematic in that I am perceiving someone in a way that is unkind? That is something classical Buddhist traditions think we ought to be mindful of. And to evaluate something as unkind is to make a judgment about it. And it's a moral judgment because we think that being kind, mostly, perhaps not always, being kind is morally better than being unkind. So the point I want to make here is that contemporary understandings of mindfulness do not necessarily share the same, do not necessarily share a moral framework that they can base their judgments on in the way that classical Buddhist traditions do. One might argue, and people have argued, that that's okay because if you are in a therapeutic context, for example, if you are in a hospital or in some other facility that abides by professional standards, there is a moral framework embedded in those professional standards. Or let's say you're at MIT and you are doing a program with Radius, and you are learning mindfulness practice. There are professional ethics that faculty, students, staff at MIT need to abide by. And so there already is a body of ethics, even if the mindfulness that one might practice is a form of non-judgmental practice. I'll spend a couple minutes talking about one particular text because I think it is helpful in understanding the relationship between mindfulness and ethics in a classical Buddhist context. And this is a book, this is 3 verses from a book by a monk who lived in North India, the latter part of the 8th century, named Shantideva. He lived at the great Buddhist university, Nalanda, the most significant and largest university in the world at the time. And he has a very famous book. Dalai Lama often refers to it as his favorite book. And it is a book which describes the path of the Bodhisattva, that is, the path of somebody who, motivated by a concern for the well-being of others, cultivates a mind that is wise and compassionate. And one of the things that Shantideva argues is a foundation of any moral cultivation is mindfulness. Being aware of the actions of body, speech, and mind at any moment. That is fundamentally the foundation of morality and ethical discipline, he says. One who wishes to guard his training must scrupulously guard his mind. There's no point in pursuing a path, Shantideva is arguing, without guarding our mind. By guarding the mind, what he's talking about is just attending to it, being mindful of it, being aware of it. It is impossible to guard one's training without guarding the wandering mind. Rutting elephants running wild do not cause as much devastation in this world as the roaming elephant, the mind, let free, creates in the Vici and other hells. So the suffering that we experience ourselves and the suffering that we inflict on others is, in Shantideva's view, primarily a result of not being mindful of our own urges, our own desires, the ways in which we are buffeted about by the conditions that we're in. But if the roaming elephant, the mind, is tethered on every side by the cord of mindfulness, every danger subsides. So in the same way that an elephant, if tamed, can be very, very effective in doing work for you, from an animal rights perspective, there may be something problematic there. I'm not endorsing, say, elephants as circus performers. But as a metaphor, you get the point that if I tame my mind, becomes both much more effective and, what Shantideva is arguing, is the condition for being moral, or at least for cultivating ethical discipline. This is not to say that one can't do a morally right act. For those of you who are thinking of Kantian ethics, it's possible to do a morally right act, whether or not one is motivated by moral reasons. One might be buffeted about, one might feel pressure to act morally. But what Shantideva is saying is that to become the kind of person who is ethically disciplined, who is non-reactive, who, if I think of my daughter, who's one of my daughters, they're both 6 years old, if they say something that might be mean to me, I understand that they're 6 years old and maybe they're tired or maybe they need something or maybe they're just having fun, but I don't get angry at them because I understand the conditions in which our relationship arises. In the same way, what Shantideva suggests is that if I'm working with other people, right, somebody gives me the finger as they're driving by, or all kinds of situations that might arise in my life, that to the degree that I am mindful, I can be less reactive and remember the conditions. Maybe that person who just gave me the finger, maybe that person had a really rough day. Who knows what happened with that person? And for Shantideva, being mindful of what my own mind is doing then allows me to attend to others in a more compassionate, kinder, and more understanding way. So for Shantideva, mindfulness is a condition of ethical discipline. And it's important to remember that just as I mentioned with the Satipatthana, mindfulness for Shantideva is part of a path that is inspired by a commitment to work for the benefit of others and to remind oneself constantly that others are just like oneself. They want to feel belonging and ease, and they don't want to feel suffering. So if you're interested in this kind of classical view more, there is a essay that I wrote that you can read. So compared to the classical views that I was just discussing, the contemporary view, some people say, is that ethics has been lost in translation. Ronald Purser has made this argument in a book that received a lot of press a couple of years ago called Mindfulness. So according to Purser, mindfulness is so persuasively powerful in the West, in North America, because it appears to have the tradition of Buddhism, perhaps other contemplative traditions behind it as an authority. And it also has the authority of modern science. As I was mentioning earlier, there are all these social scientists making these claims that we can heal and cultivate ourselves in ways that are beneficial. And this has all been documented. And the concern that people like Purser have is that the way we talk about mindfulness, implicitly, what we're suggesting is that if you're distressed, if you're having trouble, it's not because of the social and political structures in which you are embedded. It's not because of the communities, the family systems that might be structured that they cause your suffering. It's your responsibility as an individual to alleviate your stress and to come to terms with your situation and be mindful and happy on your own. It's a kind of privatization of our well-being. So for them, what they suggest is that mindfulness is a kind of perfect way of people who are not struggling against the system, but people who are coming to terms in a way that works for them with neoliberalism and the framework of consumer capitalism. This is the argument that the philosopher Slavoj Žižek makes against mindfulness. And there are plenty of other people, but what they say is it kind of pacifies us. It's a form of quietism that makes us not fight against the system, but pursue happiness, pursue well-being, pursue calm, whether we're working for a company that is polluting the world or leading to climate change or has policies that are fundamentally problematic. Well, how do you come to terms with that? Well, be more mindful. So according to this argument, ethics has essentially been lost in translation of mindfulness from Buddhist traditions to the contemporary mindfulness movement.
Well, I just want to mention there's a few questions which you may want to address now or maybe wait until the end. A couple of questions just about your own experience with mindfulness in two aspects of your life. One was parenting. There was some interest in that. And the other was teaching at university, commenting on how maybe what your experience is with mindfulness in those two contexts. And then a specific scientific question, if you know the answer. Have you looked at the scientific claims that strengthening the frontal cortex also strengthens one's sense of empathy?
I would love to feel spaciousness in exploring those questions with the participants. I wonder if I should finish.
Sure, it's up to you. I'll let you. Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to mention them in case you thought they might fit.
Okay, thanks. I'll keep an eye on the chat, and then if it fits into the slideshow, then I'll address it.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Robert.
You're welcome.
So, again, thinking about Western ethics, it's worth remembering that what we think of as virtue ethics, which is one of the great traditions of Western moral philosophy, going back to Aristotle in this image from the School of Athens by Raphael, there are virtues that Aristotle talks about, such as courage or temperance or liberality or appropriate ambition or patience, which are just like mindfulness to the degree that they may not necessarily be intrinsically, ethically right or intrinsically ethical, but they may be necessary for an ethical life. And so just because mindfulness isn't necessarily or intrinsically or inherently ethical doesn't mean that it's necessarily ethically problematic. So I just want to make that point as an aside, and then go on to the idea that some people have pushed, which is that in fact, mindfulness is actually inherently or implicitly ethical. So there's some people who've made this argument more conceptually, and there's some social scientists who have made this argument based on um, empirical studies that they've done. So here's one empirical study. They took a group of people and they taught them, one group was taught a basic mindfulness meditation over 8 weeks. Another group was taught a compassion meditation. And the third group was a control group, people who had signed up and were going to take the course but hadn't taken it yet. And then they did a study at the end where individuals, participants in the study, were invited in to do what they thought was going to be a cognitive test. But it turned out that there were actually 2 actors in the waiting room who were sitting in chairs. So this is how it goes. There's 1 or 2 people sitting in chairs. The person comes in who's part of the study, and there's one more chair. And then another actor comes in on crutches and sighs and looks at their phone and seems unhappy and in physical discomfort. The person in the study thinks that they're about to go in for a cognitive test, but in fact they are being studied at that moment to see how long it takes them to give up their seat for the person who seems to be in physical discomfort. And if after 2 minutes the person does not give up their seat, one of the actors texts the folks running the study, and the person is brought in and they do a cognitive test, which is actually has nothing to do with the study. And what these folks suggest is that, or what the evidence suggests from the empirical study, is that the people who did mindfulness meditation score equally well as the people who did compassion meditation, and it's statistically significant, the difference between both of those groups and the control group. So what they are suggesting is that, in fact, just doing mindfulness meditation makes us more open to the needs of others, makes us more empathetic, makes us more compassionate. Oops, sorry about that slide. There are other empirical studies which have suggested something similar. One direction that some studies have gone in is that measuring the way in which mindfulness increases our empathetic response towards people who are in outgroups, especially those who are ostracized. So there's a test that is widely used in the study of ostracism called the cyberball game. That's what this squares, these 4 figures. The person playing it, the person in the study, doesn't know that there aren't actual people who are the other figures. It's just a computer program. But it turns out that based on our social location and based on the way that other figures are being treated in the game, social psychologists feel that they can measure how much ostracism or how much empathetic concern one might have. And there are studies, such as this one from the Journal of Experimental Psychology, that suggests that mindfulness practice diminishes the degree to which one might ostracize based on age, impairment, race, ethnicity, or gender. And so for these folks, the argument is that, in fact, mindfulness is inherently or implicitly ethical. And you see a lot of work on race as well in mindfulness. There are plenty of studies that suggest that mindfulness meditation reduces implicit age and race bias. Sally Haslinger is on the board of Radius, and so I thought I'd throw this slide in. According to Haslinger, race is primarily constructed through hierarchical power relations of subordination and privilege. And one might say, well, how would mindfulness address that? Doesn't that have to do with policies, cultural institutions, political institutions, economic policy? And I wouldn't dispute that. I think that's right. However, I also think that race is not just the way race works, and I imagine she might agree with this. It becomes embodied in our perception, in our affects, how we perceive the world. And one great example of that, I think, is illustrated by Judith Butler's essay, Endangered Endangering, Schematic Racism and White Paranoia. It's from a book called Reading Rodney King. And what Butler is investigating there is, how is it possible that a white jury could look at that video of Rodney King being beaten by a dozen police officers and be persuaded by their argument that they were in danger, that Rodney King was endangering them, when it's clear, at least it seems clear, that he is lying on the ground being surrounded by a bunch of men who are beating him with a stick. What she suggests is that the way white people, at least certainly the white people on this jury, but perhaps many other white people, presumably many other white people, perceive the male black body as threatening intrinsically. There's a way in which, yes, race may be socially constructed through politics or through a political act of subordination, but it lives in our bodies and in our perceptions and our affects. Every time we look out into the world, how we see people is racialized. And so the idea that mindfulness can reform, as we see with Céline Leboeuf here, reform our racialized bodily habits is an important idea, I think, because what it introduces is the idea that through mindfulness, in our perception, we can pause. We can have a moment of pausing such that our automatic response, our automatic response to the racialized bodies of others is diminished. And I have just a couple more slides and then we'll be done. So, a third way of thinking about ethics and mindfulness is that no matter what, it's always embedded in a particular cultural context. So here we have some Buddhist nuns meditating. Here we have someone in the military meditating. Here we have somebody meditating out in a field. They're very different cultural contexts. And then what mindfulness means is going to be different for the Buddhist nun, for whom it's on the path to awakening that is integrated into an ethical framework, and the person who sees it as a part of a path or part of a context to become a calmer, perhaps a better parent, or just a calmer, kinder person. And so there is no such thing, I would argue, as mindfulness that is ahistorical. There's no meaning that is ahistorical of mindfulness. Mindfulness is always understood, or always ought to be understood, as something within a particular context that is social and involves other people. So, a couple final comments then about the ethical relevance of mindfulness. So perhaps the biggest challenge to our mindfulness for most of us these days is our phones. There's some contexts in which looking at our phones or being distracted by our phone is not particularly morally relevant. So if I'm riding on the subway and I look at my phone, There's nothing morally problematic about that. But if I'm mindless, say in a relationship, someone's trying to have an important conversation with me and I'm looking at my phone, or if I'm looking at my phone while I'm driving, those are deeply ethical issues. That is, being mindful in some contexts is the morally right way to be, and being mindless in some contexts is immoral. How we focus our attention and what we do with our attention is in fact morally relevant. So there's ample evidence that mindfulness reduces suffering and is thus morally relevant from that perspective. I think anything that can reduce suffering is morally relevant, though that doesn't mean that it's intrinsically moral. There are some things that might reduce suffering that may not be things that we choose. Certainly for Nietzsche and for other philosophers, and for myself, I guess, there are times when I would want to take on some suffering and not simply have my suffering reduced. But as with Shantideva, then, mindfulness on its own is not intrinsically moral. Like courage and other Aristotelian virtues, it can support moral development. But I think something that's really important to remember is that when we think about ethics and mindfulness, I think it is the case that there are many instances when mindlessness, when not being mindful, because it shows a lack of care for the lives of others on the road, a lack of care for the people we're in community with, a lack of care for the people around us, that mindlessness is a vice. And in those contexts, mindfulness is a virtue. And in those contexts, it's not simply a virtue because of what it allows us to do. It's a virtue and is intrinsically, in those contexts, is intrinsically ethical. So I guess the important point I wanted to make here is that being mindful of when we need to be mindful is something that we have an ethical responsibility for. And in that sense, I would argue that mindfulness is, in fact, deeply ethical. So that is what I wanted to share with you, and I'm happy to
Great.
have a discussion.
Okay. Thanks, William, so much for that discussion, which I think is very subtle and nuanced. I learned a lot from it, particularly how you wrap things up at the end. I want to encourage people to ask questions. We do have a few so far. I'll just read them, and you can choose how to answer them. So there was the first two about just someone who was curious about your experiences in either mindful parenting or teaching at a university. I'm not sure exactly what's being asked, but I think just to share maybe how mindfulness might be part of your experience or relevant to the topic of your discussion today in those contexts.
Great. So I do think mindfulness is relevant to parenting. I might take a step back, though, and say what might be even more important and what's really important for mindfulness is getting enough sleep. I think for many parents, especially perhaps during COVID when people are taking work home and children are at home, it's very hard to be mindful if one is sleep deprived. And even more than mindfulness, perhaps, sleep is the biggest condition of our happiness. So, say more about our own mindful parenting. Well, we don't have Wi-Fi at home, and we don't have a television, and we live in Vermont, and our kids spend a lot of time outside, and they don't really they don't have a whole lot of screen time. So that is probably not an option for the vast majority of parents today, though. And yeah, I don't particularly have expertise on mindful parenting, but since the question is about, say, more about my own mindful parenting, we integrate moments of silence into our day. Before lunch and dinner, we gather and we're in silence. And our daughters, who are 6, they take turns ringing a little bell, and just building in easy little rituals that allow for spaciousness and a little bit of mindfulness, I think, are important. Listening skills, mindfully listening to each other. So we often do rose, thorn, bud, saying something that worked well that day, something that was challenging, something we're looking forward to, just as a practice of sharing and connecting, but also mindfully listening to each
It's great. Thank you. The next one, which I mentioned earlier, was have you looked at, I know you mentioned sociological studies, but have you looked at scientific claims that strengthening the frontal cortex also strengthens one's sense of empathy?
other. So, um, there is a lot written about neurobiological correlates and traits such as empathy. I I don't I don't really have expertise to talk about that. I also tend to be suspicious of isolating one thought or another, or one affect or one feeling with one particular part of the brain. My sense is that most neuroscientists today um, think that everything is so interconnected that that's very hard to do. And but I don't really have expertise to address that.
Then we had a question which was posed when you were talking about race. Would you say that mindfulness has a greater impact on different people of different races?
Um, I'm not sure that I understand where the question is coming from. Maybe I could start addressing some things that come up for me, and the person could elaborate on that question. In the text that I was putting up, there are two ways of thinking about mindfulness and race that might be different for folks who identify with different races, who are identified by others as belonging to different races. One is the way that mindfulness can help people like myself who are white, or people like myself who are male, cisgendered, and educated in a particular way, and middle class, and all the ways in which I might look at others in particular ways, that I might be able to introduce a pause, be mindful of the projection I might be making on this other person's body that could be racialized in ways that um, are widespread. And it's obviously not just white people who racialize according to problematic hierarchies. People who are themselves racialized do that also, maybe not as much. If you're used to living with people who look a particular way, you're less likely to um, racialize them in problematic ways. But there's another way that race is discussed in the context of mindfulness that might be different, and that is self-care. So people who may be going through life in a society that doesn't recognize them as a fully valid form of human being, or um, they go through life racialized in ways that are um, more likely to lead to stress and mental health challenges. That mindfulness there can be a kind of liberatory practice. Not that it is enough and that one wouldn't want to work to change the society for either of these groups, but that one can change one's own racial perceptions, and one might be able to take better care of one's own needs, and um, find strength and resilience through mindfulness practice. I I should say at the Barre Center for Buddhist Studies, where I work, we offer courses, programs, retreats that address both of those. So if anybody there is interested, we have a course coming up for white folks that engages Buddhist practice as a way of working with being white in the contemporary moment. And we also offer programs that are specifically for people of color. And so, yeah, I think mindfulness can be used in multiple ways in the context of race.
Great. We have another question. You said mindfulness is culturally situated. Then it seems it might enable different cultural scripts. In a study, you mentioned yielding one's seat to someone else who needs it more, but it might also enable putting aside spontaneous compassion towards civilians in a trained soldier following culturally situated advice by Japanese Zen teachers in World War II. No shortcut to infallibly seeing how things are or what one should do.
Yeah, I think, and that's not really a question, it's a really perceptive and insightful comment, and I agree with everything that Leonard is saying. There's a lot of great work by people like Brian Victoria showing that Buddhism, for example, is was used in really problematic ways in the imperial period. And if you think of, say, Myanmar and the genocide against the Rohingya, or the way in which Buddhists in Sri Lanka, the dominant Sinhalese, have treated the Tamils, the Hindu minority, there's one should certainly resist any idea that Buddhists in general or universally are somehow kinder, or that mindfulness practice will somehow make us necessarily just and ethical. And I think Leonard is pointing that out. And I think part of that does have to do with cultural situatedness.
Any other questions? You know, I had some questions at the beginning, but I know you said you were addressing this in a certain way based on an understanding of what some skepticism or questions might be. So I think you've already answered all of my questions in advance.
Okay, well, let me see. There was one other question about teaching.
Yes,
That I
your
never,
experience in mindful teaching or applying mindfulness in teaching.
yeah. And I should say that there is a organization called the Center for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education, which has an enormous amount of resources, syllabi, conferences, webinars, and in the summers when there's not COVID, they have a week-long training to help develop a course that can integrate mindfulness. And again, I think with regards to teaching, there are different ways of thinking about it. For some people, it's teaching mindfulness with students. And there's a whole body of literature on that, the obstacles to that and the benefits to that. And then there's another way of thinking about mindfulness and teaching, and that is the question of self-care, or the question of not being overwhelmed, especially today with COVID and all the online teaching that everybody's doing. But also, if you're a professor, semesters are grueling. If you are preparing your teaching, you're grading papers, you are perhaps coming home to take care of your family, there's everything that has to be done at home. It is exhausting. And so having some way of maintaining one's own resilience so that one can be empathetic with students, so that one can remember that students also are having bad days, that they are coming from very particular places, that it's not about, the teaching is not about making all the students know what I know and what I think is important, but it's about meeting them where they are and supporting them as they grow. And that often takes moments of mindfulness to pause and get out of my own agenda and be attentive to the needs of the students.
Great, thank you. Looks like we don't have any other questions, so I'd just like to thank you, William, again for this conversation. I think it's so timely, now that mindfulness is everywhere, and yet so much of where we see it, there's not an ethical component to it. So I think we really need to have more of this kind of conversation about the relationship of mindfulness to ethics, and really I've learned a lot from it. You've opened my eyes to it, and I hope we can do more through Radius around mindfulness and ethics.
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you. Thank you so much, William. This was fabulous, and we're very grateful. And Robert, thank you, as
You're welcome.
always.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Trish.
Trisha.
All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.